Connor. So as you noticed, Laura did hit the record button, and so you just need to acknowledge it in order to see the screen. As I said, I'm in the Cold Climate Housing Research Center, and our instructor today, Connor Dennehy, is an energy auditor and project manager here at CCHRC as well. And Lauren is from Information Insights, and she is the most important one dealing with all of the technology and running the polls that we will see here shortly. So on to next page. Oh, you know what? I completely forgot Connor's bio. Connor Dennehy is an energy auditor and researcher at NREL's Cold Climate Housing Research Center in Fairbanks, where he collaborates on high-performance residential construction projects through energy analysis, mechanical design, and workforce development. His research efforts focus on cold climate appropriate building technologies, especially HVAC technologies. All right, next slide. So now for Zoom etiquette and a little bit practice with Zoom. So the mute button is in the lower left of the screen. If you hover your mouse over the screen, you should see a bunch of icons along the bottom. We will be, if you hover over the participants or click on participants, you can hover over your name and then you should be able to see mute, unmute, as well as you should be able to click on more and change your name, because for the CEU credits, we need to be able to match your name to the registration so that I can send the certificate to the correct email. Let's practice a little bit with a poll. So Lauren, if you can open the poll, we will have several polls throughout. They will just pop up on your screen. There can be several questions, so you can scroll up and down on the poll, and you just choose your questions and then hit the, I believe, submit button. I actually don't see that one. As we are going through that, if you want, if you have a question, you can raise your hand. That is under the reactions button on the bottom of the screen. And if you have questions, you can also put them into the chat box. So that's the chat button on the bottom of the screen. You can close that chat box and just hit chat again when you want to see it again, and it will pop up once again. Since this class is worth a CEU credit, please do stay engaged and ask questions, and do make sure that we can match your name to the name and email address that you registered with. All right. I think, Lauren, you can close the poll and share the results.
So it looks like we've got a couple people from Fairbanks, one from Juno, and one, I believe, from Sitka. And then a lot of people heard about the class from social media and other sources. A couple people just interested in learning about heat pumps for their homes, wanting the CEU credits, just interested in learning more about heat pumps in general.
Awesome. Thank you. So now for the outline of the course, Connor will cover about ductless heat pumps, how they work, the types, advantages and disadvantages, and the core climate best practices. He will then go into energy efficiency and how that relates to heat pumps, the green addendum, and resources for home buyers to learn more both about heat pumps and about how to finance a heat pump. And please do not hesitate to ask any questions. This is actually a shorter class than the one 2 days ago, but we have fewer audience members, so we can definitely answer more questions as they come up. So Connor, please take it away.
Thanks, Dana. Hi, everybody. My name is Connor Dennehy. As Dana said, I'm a researcher at the Cold Climate Housing Research Center in Fairbanks, part of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. We're a fairly small group today, so feel free to pop in with as many questions as you like. I think I'll be able to see an indication if you raise your hand. So feel free to stop me before we go on too far. The goal of today is to essentially get you informed on what a heat pump is. As Meadow mentioned, we like to have an interest in emerging technologies. For Alaska, this is an emerging technology. If you've lived outside the state or down south, I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia. So the term heat pump was thrown around like crazy. Everybody has one and everybody's familiar with them. But up here, it's where the technology has grown and started to be appropriate for a cold climate. They're a relatively new thing. So a lot of people are curious about them. What can they do? What can't they do? And so that's what we're going to try to outline today, so you can navigate through the hype and figure out what specifically they can do for you or your clients. So generally, what is a heat pump? It's a appliance that will space condition your house. So you either provide cooling or heating. If you're unfamiliar with a heat pump, they're very similar to your refrigerator. Your refrigerator is essentially a one-way heat pump. So you're actively taking the heat out of that box. It's rejecting that heat into your house. And so that's why if you ever look behind your fridge or underneath it with those coils, it feels hot. That's heat that it's extracting out of that box and it's dumping into your house. With these mini split or ductless mini split systems, that same concept is happening. So in the summertime, they'd be rejecting that heat to the outside, or for heating mode, they're trying to extract as much heat from the outside as possible. And that's why in a cold climate, they don't necessarily work as well, because the colder it gets, the less heat is available outside to use. And so these machines take that heat that is available either in the air or the ground or the water, and then through the refrigeration cycle and the compressor, they step it up with some electricity and it turns into usable heat for yourself or cooling, like I said. And so the family or hierarchy of heat pumps is you have heat pumps, and they can either be an air source heat pump or a ground source heat pump. We're going to focus on air source heat pumps in this presentation, and air source heat pumps can be broken down further into a split system or a mini split system. So if you've ever seen here in the picture, we're looking at mini splits, but if you've ever seen larger air conditioners or compressors outside of people's houses down in the lower 48, it's likely to be a traditional split system. So we'll be focusing on mini splits. And then the further categorization of that is we're going to focus on ductless mini splits. So the picture on the left shows you the interior head of the ductless mini split. And that's actually where the fan is that helps distribute the heat or the cooling. That's why it's called a ductless, because it's just the interior head. So I just want to give a brief overview of market penetration for heat pumps in general. So as I mentioned, in a lot of the warmer climates, this is a technology that's been around for a long time, decades. So people are pretty familiar with it. But as you kind of move up this chart and get into colder areas, you can see where natural gas, Alaska fuel oil is pretty predominant, but those fossil fuels that have been around for a long time, that's predominantly what you're going to find, because they're reliable at cold temperatures and they work for people's homes. But as the heat pump technology increases, and it really is year over year, it gets better and more efficient and able to operate at lower temperatures. You're starting to see more people be aware, more people get them. And then that is, a positive feedback loop where the more people get them, the more manufacturers are incentivized to make them work in a variety of climates. So I just want to give a little overview of like where heat pumps are appropriate. So I saw we had a few people from Juno. So we've got the Thermalize campaign in Juno with Alaska Heat Smart. And essentially that is like a crowdsourcing campaign to get heat pumps to be distributed throughout Juno. Juno is a pretty great place, especially Southeast in general, where you have hydropower, relatively mild climate, considering like Fairbanks and other places more north in Alaska. So those two things combine for a really perfect fit for heat pumps, to where they can operate throughout most of the temperatures that are available, and they've got relatively inexpensive electricity to operate with. When you start looking at some of the other locations where power is more expensive and winters get a little bit more colder, that's where the line gets drawn to where a heat pump will function correctly or not. And so we do like to consider heat pumps to be part of a renewable energy portfolio or pushing towards electrification, because they're using energy from the air or the ground. So that's renewable, and infinite, as long as the outside conditions are appropriate. And when you pair that with a power grid that's, operating at a relatively clean mix, then all those things work together towards a really clean energy use and moving towards sustainability and renewability. And so depending on where you're talking about them, you'll hear people refer to them as a renewable energy source. So just want to keep in mind that it's definitely true, can be true, but it's site specific. All right, so I touched a little bit earlier about how does a heat pump work, but here is a simplified breakdown of the constituent parts, and we're in heating mode here. So obviously the interior of the house, these red arrows indicate heat is coming out. But these are copper tubes that are filled with refrigerant. The refrigerant type can vary, but it's mostly a standard approach. But essentially, we are extracting heat from the outside air here. So through the process of the refrigerant just being a chemical that operates at some interesting thermodynamic properties. So it's able to absorb heat out of the air, even at very low temperatures. And then through the compressor, we're squeezing the energy out. And so we're distributing heat inside the house, and this operates continuously. And the unique thing about a heat pump is that seasonally, this whole cycle basically can reverse. And so you can imagine this would be cold, and then we're distributing heat into the outside. And we won't really have the issues here in Alaska, but similarly to how there is a kind of cutoff for cold temperatures, there's also a cutoff for hot temperatures. So there's only so much heat you can dump into the air when it's like 100 something degrees out. So heat pumps or air conditioners in general, they all have limits on either side. And so just knowing that they're not a perfect machine really helps manage expectations for them. And so here, I want to show, this is what a ground source, sorry, that pops up. There we go. That's what a ground source heat pump install would look like. There's a lot more equipment involved. Ground source heat pumps are great because the ground is a much more stable temperature than the air. So it's pretty consistent. It's going to be hovering around freezing more or less throughout most of Alaska, up to like 40 degrees. And so even in the middle of winter, you can still tap into that decent temperature source. Whereas on the right side, where we've got the air source heat pump, there is a limit. Once the outdoor air gets so cold, you can only extract so much heat from it. And so the installed cost of a ground source heat pump is going to be much greater than an air source heat pump, because you've got to involve drilling equipment, you got to have the space for it. Depending on where you are, your water, your local water type, all of that will affect your site specific condition, but it has some, greater operating conditions than an air source heat pump. So all of this, you're going to hear me say throughout this presentation that it depends and it's site specific. And that's definitely true. We can make some generalizations, but throughout all of these things, they are unique to each location. And so the air source heat pump, the fundamental challenge that I've more or less been talking about is, when do they work and where do they work? And so we've got a graph here that we're showing cold temperatures, or we're showing temperature on the bottom with cold on the left and hot on the right. And this is your heat output. So what the heat pump can deliver for you, or the demand of the house. And so right here in the middle is what's called the balance point. And so that's the point where your heat pump is matched perfectly with the demand of your house. So say it's the middle of November and it's 20 degrees out, and you've got a 18,000 BTU per hour heat pump and it's working perfectly, you could be near the balance point for that load. And so once it gets colder, so down here, suddenly our house demand is greater than the heat pump output here. So we've got this heat deficit over here. So you may find yourself, if you only have an air source heat pump with no backup heat near a cold location, you're going to have a heat deficit. And so a lot of people are like, well, let me just put a bigger unit in there that'll solve all my problems. And that's partially true. But over here in this heat surplus area, which could happen over here in the cold, but I'm using this side as an example, you'll have trouble with the machine operating on an efficient cycle. It'll basically run in starts and stops. And so if you can imagine, warming up your car in the winter or something like that, if you had to start it, 4 separate times before you actually got in the car, you might start to wonder, am I, putting some wear and tear on my vehicle? Same kind of concept happens if you oversize a heat pump. It just doesn't get a smooth cycle going. And so with air source heat pumps, we can get the heat multiple different ways. So here's a few lab experiments we've got set up. So they're, obviously you're not going to see this configuration in a home, although sometimes you never know in Alaska. So the first one, we've got the hydronic system. So we're using a liquid to distribute that heat. So if you're familiar with in-floor heating or baseboard, things like that, that would be hydronics. And so we compare air source heat pump with this. In the middle, we have ductwork. So people generally call this forced air. And so we compare a ducted heat pump to ductwork. And then here on the right, we've got the ductless interior head, which is mostly what we're kind of focusing on today, because that's what people are really interested in, because it'll help them. People don't necessarily want to convert completely to an air source heat pump as their primary heat source. And so using the ductless head will maybe allow them to partially offset some of their load, also get some cooling benefits, and then they don't so much have to worry about the entire household, so they can stick it on like a bonus room in the garage or a new renovation that's being tacked on, those sorts of things. And so a ductless heat pump can also come in a few different varieties. So it definitely gets really tough to track this hierarchy of heat pumps, and there's so many options. But basically, this one here in the middle is the ductless mini split head that we've been seeing there before. So there's a little fan in there, and it sends out air. This one on the bottom is part of a hydronic system. So they're a little bit larger, but similar to having like radiators placed throughout your house. This is the exact same concept, just only paired with a heat pump. And then likewise, we have these cassettes that can get placed in the ceiling. This is going to be something you're more likely to see in like a light commercial or an office setting. But these two types of things do exist. So a lot of people, even before we get into the specific like science of is this appropriate for your house, we can think about just the layout of your house. Is it appropriate? So a house that, the more open floor plan a house, the more applicable a ductless heat pump is for it. So you can see we've got these yellow boxes here, which simulate this is the outside unit of the heat pump. And then that one down in the dining room is the indoor head. And so you can see these red arrows indicating the heat that will be coming off of the ductless mini split. And the further we get away from it, and the more turns and nooks and crannies we got to work through, the colder that air is going to be. So there's a limit to how much space you can serve with these. And so this can be solved a couple different ways. You can actually get a configuration that has multiple indoor heads attached to the outdoor head. And that's great. You'll be able to serve more places. The caveat to that is the more heads you add to a single outdoor unit, the less efficient it will become. And so you can tackle this a second way and say, I'll just get 2 single head systems. And that's great. And you can put, one on this side of the house, and we can put one, maybe you could do a double split head up here and put one in each bedroom, because everybody likes their bedrooms to be a specific temperature. And that's all well and good. The things to keep in mind is people see price tags for ductless mini splits and they're like, wow, that's incredibly cheap. I can get one for $2,000 because I saw that online. And then once you actually start to think about the install, what's needed in the house and all the accessories and things, suddenly if you're installing 3 or 4 mini splits in a house, you're getting to a price point that's almost competitive with the conventional system. So what have you really gained out of the ductless scenario? So it's just something to think about, and whether the house is actually a good fit for it. And so that's kind of the architectural fit for the heat pump. And so thinking about the science of, is the heat pump appropriate for you? A lot of people talk about heat pumps and their efficiency in several different terms, but the main kind of universal term is the COP, or the coefficient of performance. So this is the heat delivered by the heat pump over the electrical energy supplied to the heat pump. So an easy way to think of this is desired over required. I would desire 1,000 BTUs of heat, and how much power is required to deliver that. And so this is always going to be a positive number. If you see a COP of 1, that is equivalent to like electric baseboard. So folks in the Southeast might be more familiar with seeing electric baseboard out there, or a toaster. And that's essentially when you have 1 unit of heat is delivered by 1 unit of electrical energy. So your COP would be a 1. And so heat pumps take advantage of the refrigeration cycle that we mentioned earlier, and they can get COPs closer to like 3 or 4, or in really optimal temperatures, we can see as high as like 5 and 6. So the takeaway from this is the higher the COP, the better the unit. The tricky thing about COP is it's not just, you stick that number on the nameplate of the unit and it's exactly what it does all the time. The COP will change based on temperature. And so I guess I should have skipped to this one on the last one, but here's the toaster example here at the top. So that's our 1-to-1 ratio, and the COP is pretty much consistent. That's always going to be what you're going to get. With the ductless heat pump, our exterior conditions are really going to affect that COP. And if you see the term HSPF, which is another way, that is the Department of Energy's official way of categorizing the efficiency for heat pumps. That is, more or less the same terms of COP. And mostly what you can think about is the higher the HSPF, the higher the COP. So you just really have to kind of gauge, who you're talking to and how familiar they are with these things. A COP is a pretty simple way of talking about it. You may get some really engaged homeowners that start getting a little nerdy on some of the science behind it. So it is good to know the multiple ways to talk about it. But I'd say COP is the easiest universal way to talk about it. So to kind of cap off a lot of that is, there are a lot of advantages to ductless heat pumps, and there'll be some disadvantages, which I'll go over next. So there's a potential to reduce your energy costs. So depending on how much you pay for electricity and what you've already got on hand, you may be able to reduce your energy costs, or it may have other advantages, like it's not a net gain on reducing energy costs, but now you can provide some cooling in the summer. So here in Fairbanks, we've got a 1.5-week period to where it'd be really great to have some air conditioning. For the most part, you don't need it at all unless you're in a commercial setting or things like that. So that's one of the more like intangible advantages for you. So again, it's considered a renewable heat as long as the outdoor conditions are favorable. You can heat your house all day long, all night long, to whatever temperature you want. It's going to be working great. Because of that, there's no combustion on site. So we're using heat exchangers and refrigerants to extract the heat from the outside and put it into the house. And so that's good for your outdoor air quality, both locally and for like your town. Here in Fairbanks in the winter, we've got some outdoor air quality issues here in the winter. So if we can reduce any specific site combustion, then that's really helpful for the community as a whole. And so if you're outside of the municipality, you may be using fuel oil. Historically, we've had some high price fuel oil events, kind of like what we're seeing now. And people tend to get a little crazy. They start stealing other people's fuel oil, or you run out because you're not really paying attention to how much you've got. So you don't have to worry about that as it's happening. And so when you call out the fuel oil company, generally going to have spills that occur. So you're avoiding all of that with an air source heat pump. Ductless mini split is pretty much low maintenance as far as a homeowner goes. There's like a small filter on it, which they just have to keep clean. And that's pretty much it. The rest of it is mostly self-driven. There's not too much to do with that. You can get pretty fancy with the controls and programming setbacks and schedules and all sorts of things like that. And most of them come with a remote, or you have the ability to have like a wired thermostat. So some of the disadvantages, if you're not in some of the milder climates in Alaska, then it's probably not going to be your primary heat source. So you're going to need a backup heat source. You've got to consider how are these going to interact. So either you've got to make a choice that, at 20 degrees, I'm going to turn off my heat pump and I'm going to go back to my Toyo, or I'm going to go back to my boiler. Depending on how involved the homeowner is, they can do math to figure out what's most advantageous price-wise. If they're interested in their carbon emissions, they can do a carbon emissions calculation to figure out, oh, I can run this down to 15. At that point, I'm no longer saving carbon emissions. I should switch back to my other fuel source. So there are some complications with that, or you can just be very straightforward and say, as soon as it hits 25, I'm not even going to worry about it. I'm going to switch over to the other one. We are using electricity to get this power, so you are subject to power outages when or where they happen. And so it is good to have other heat sources on hand just to make sure you can ride those out, whether they're short burst or a little bit longer. Historically, if you are familiar with heat pumps in the lower 48, they can be pretty loud. If you see that compressor outside of somebody's house, those tend to be very large. So people talk in terms of tonnage for this type of equipment. So you might see like a 5-ton piece of equipment hanging outside somebody's house. And when it cuts on, the whole neighborhood knows it cuts on. You can hear that fan. So a lot of people don't like that. With these mini splits, they're much smaller. You're looking at things more on the order of like 1 ton, 1.5 ton, or even 2 ton. But they've also got extra efficient motors in them. So all of this, the technology has been progressing year over year to get more appropriate for cold climates. They're also getting quieter. So, but I wouldn't be surprised if people will ask you, is this noisy? And you can pretty much tell them that it is not noisy at all. Some builders may install them attached to the house. In that case, it'd be good to know whether they used vibration dampers on them, because there is a slight chance that when that machine's running, that you can notice, similar to if you've got a dryer that spins really fast and somebody's like, I kind of hear a vibration, or your well pump's going, it'd be in line with that. Just something that some people would notice, not everybody would. So another thing is, this is a new and emerging technology. So there is a learning curve for people, and whether that learning curve is just the expectation that they think the heat pump is going to work perfectly all the time at any temperature, or even just dealing with some of the fancy, programmable portions of it. Not everybody's used to operating with things like that. So just being able to manage their expectations. Manufacturers all have pretty useful user guides, tons of infographics and things like that. But it's just something to be aware of. And then, like I mentioned, if it's not your only heating appliance, you need to have a strategy for incorporating it. That strategy can be very simple, from just, it's November 15th, I'm not going to run it anymore, or it's 20 degrees, I'm not going to run it anymore, or you can have somebody take it to the nth degree with all sorts of calculations. So it all depends. And so all of this has been talking about heat pumps in general, which are really, really efficient forms of heating as long as the conditions are right. But the cheapest form of energy is the one you don't have to buy. And so whether we're recommending heat pumps or solar PV systems for people, any type of renewable system, we want them to take a look at their house first, because if we can take some energy efficiency measures and save some energy beforehand, then the new equipment that's coming along, you can either have smaller equipment than you did before if you've reduced your heat load, or it's just going to operate more efficiently. It's really important for heat pumps because they're kind of sensitive equipment and they can operate really well with optimal conditions. But if you've got a house and it's not operating that efficiently, then somebody can bring in a heat pump and they might be a little bit disappointed with how the actual operation of it is going. So it's good to get out ahead of all of that and get in contact with an energy auditor for the house, do some air sealing, add some insulation, take a look at the doors, the windows, weather stripping, all of these factors. And once we kind of address some of those things, you can wind up getting a smaller heat pump, smaller solar PV system. They'll have a more comfortable home in general, so they're more likely to appreciate the equipment that's gone in. And all of these things lead to more durable building, and ideally it'll have better air quality. And so kind of building off of that and thinking about efficiency in general. So we want it insulated and airtight. So I'd say over the past few years, there's been more of a awareness of indoor air quality. for many different reasons. And when you insulate and air seal a house, if you don't provide a means to exchange air between the outside and the inside, then you've essentially locked somebody inside of a fridge or a freezer. So we've got to give them a way to stay comfortable thermally, but we've also got to provide fresh outside air. So you want to combine these different mechanical systems together to make sure that somebody's actually having good air quality and good thermal performance. And so if you're not familiar with energy audits in general, this is a couple pictures that show what an energy auditor would do. This is obviously on a larger location than a house. So people will put blower doors through the front door of the house. And so with a single fan, you won't need as many for a residential setting. They can essentially figure out exactly how much air is leaking through the house's envelope. So that's the walls, the roof, floor, doors, windows, anything that is between the interior and the exterior. And so once we've paired that air leakage, and they can take an infrared camera and they can really start to hone in on where there's conduction or air leakage happening, we can start to figure out a plan for how to solve the energy inefficiencies of the house. And so they'll take all that information, they'll plug it into an energy model. You're all familiar with AK Warm or ACWARM and its star ratings that it creates. And so all of that is a way of categorizing how efficient the home is. And then based off that information, you can figure out a plan to make it more efficient beyond that. So obviously 6-star was the most efficient, 1-star being the least efficient. So if an audit's done in a house and it's pushing, 5 stars, 5-star plus, like a heat pump might be a good fit for it. It's still totally site specific for that, but that might give you a good range. If somebody hands you an ACWARM report for a 2-star house and it's in Fairbanks, you probably want to steer them away from heat pumps just yet until they actually take care of some of these energy efficiency measures. And so after we've done all of this testing in the house, the most important thing is safety and combustion safety. So one of the benefits of a heat pump is there is no combustion. So there's no carbon monoxide that can be made. It's inherently safe. Likely in the colder locations, they'll still have their original equipment. And so you want to make sure as you make the house more airtight, that you're not like starving that system of combustion air. Because if a human and a mechanical appliance are competing for the same air, the machine's going to win out. It's going to take that indoor air. If it can't exhaust properly, you're going to get carbon monoxide in the house, and carbon monoxide is incredibly dangerous. There's always terribly sad headlines in Alaska every winter to where somebody has succumbed from carbon monoxide poisoning. So we want to avoid that. And so part of the energy audit process is performing these combustion safety tests. So if you're not familiar with where to find them, the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation's website has a list of local energy auditors. GVA's website has some energy auditor tips. I think they've even got their own staff on hand or subcontracted staff on hand to do some light energy audits if you're in the interior area. And then ideally, we want to be able to get people to do these measures and install heat pumps, and those cost money. So the best way to get people to do that is to offer them rebates or financing. So we'll be sharing these slides. These hyperlinks will become available to you. But the first one is for AHFC's Energy Efficiency Rebate Program. And then the 45L tax credit is applicable to new construction. So you have to keep that in mind, that certain things are only going to be available whether you're in the new construction stage or the retrofit stage. And so here's a screenshot of the green addendum. And basically, I'd say for the past some odd years, people have been complaining that I've got a super efficient house, but it's not being comped correctly against the other houses. And that's because it's a lot of things that are behind the scenes. You can't see them. And so how do we wind up standardizing the playing field? And so this is a way that has been adopted nationally, not in every state, but AHFC has been advocating for and incorporating this way. And you all are probably much more familiar with how addendums actually factor into the real estate transaction process than I am. But I will say that it's good for helping to provide an equal playing field, so you can see a house that may have more bedrooms, more features, but it's relatively inefficient when you compare it to a house that from the outside looks like there's less to it, but it's got more things happening in the background. So all of that will hopefully encourage people to be a little bit more energy conscious in the homes they're purchasing. And so essentially, if you're not already familiar with the Green Addendum, here's a little bit of a background on it. But as I said, it's a way of leveling the playing field for people that have been either builders that have been building high performance homes, or people who have made certain high performance retrofits to their own home, and now they're looking to sell, and how they actually justify their investment and try to get something out of it later. And then for the buyer, how can they be informed as to what they're buying? Because maybe this person spent all their money on insulation, heat pumps, but siding looks terrible. So how do they kind of justify or juggle all of these different perks? So to kind of round things out, I want to distribute some resources for the heat pump technologies in general. So we're going to advocate for ourselves here. Go to the CCHRC website, so cchrc.org. We've got a few publications on heat pumps in general, but there's all sorts of resources for making the house more efficient, making sure the air quality is adequate. We've got a good amount of infographic style things that are more applicable for a homeowner or someone like that. And then we've also got several technical publications if you've got a particularly engaged client or builder, or if you yourself are just looking to find out some more. So Alaska Heat Smart and Juno is who we've been working with on the Thermalize campaign in Juno. So they're a great resource for those in the Southeast, and the state at large, but especially the Southeast. And then a few of these are a little bit more on the technical side, but they're good resources. And mostly all of what they're focusing on is the physics of, is this heat pump appropriate for your house? Because maybe it'll check a lot of boxes. I've got an open floor plan. I really want it. My electricity is cheap. But if the conditions of the house's insulation and air tightness and outside temperature don't work out, then it may not be a good investment for them. So all in all, you have to find out what you know beforehand before you actually install it. And then lastly, so energy efficiency, which should always come along for the ride when we're talking about renewable technologies, whether they're heat pumps or solar, like I said before. So here's a few different resources. The Building America Solutions Center is, it's a national thing. So if you go on there, there are good resources, but you might see a few things. They do a good job of breaking it out by climate zone, but you might see something that you'd be like, wow, I would never do that here. So take it with a grain of salt. But most of these top ones are all specific to Alaska in general. One that I do want to highlight is called the Desire database, if those of you are familiar with that. But essentially that is a kind of clearinghouse for rebates. So like if you were to go on there, you type in Alaska, you won't see a ton in Alaska compared to some other states, but all of the applicable national programs will pop up. So like the 45L tax credit will pop up, and then you can select those and figure out, is the house appropriate for this? So are you in a stage of new construction? Are you in a stage of a retrofit? Are you at the stage of a real estate transaction to where you want to pair in an energy efficient loan from a bank? So it kind of ties all of those things together, but it's a good database to be able to look through. So I would definitely recommend that one. And that would be the DSIREUSA.org, Desire. And so here locally and nationally, we've got a few different resources that we're just want to show you here. So Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, many of you are definitely familiar with HFC. USDA has grants. A lot of their grants are focused on renewable technologies. So it might just be solar PV, but they do have things in there for energy efficiency every once in a while. And so you might find for some of your clients that are outside of the municipalities, even if it's like a small business. So the USDA does a lot of small business stuff. So you might be able to encourage some of them to look into this, and they can pair energy efficiency upgrades with heat pumps and all of that together. So the USDA would be a really a good resource for that. And then relatively recently, we've got the heat pump loan program. So that's a partnership between the True North Federal Credit Union and Alaska Heat Smart. And so this is a way of trying to increase that market adoption of heat pumps. And so we can finance people to get the heat pumps in their house. And so that's a great way, because a lot of people don't want to, spend a large deposit essentially on a relatively unknown technology to them. If they're already familiar with it, they may be much more willing. But if somebody's on the fence, providing a financing option is a good way to get people moving on that type of stuff. And so this is something that the Thermalize campaign is doing in Juno, but it's something you can probably reach out to if you're outside of the state to get more, or outside of Juno to get more information on what's applicable locally. And so kind of highlighting a lot of Juno things. So those folks will be happy here, but we've got the Juno Carbon Offset Fund. And so they're doing a lot to pair these technologies with different things. So as we think about electrification and reducing the impacts of consumer usage at the household level, all of that pairs up to the grid level. And so how can we reduce our carbon footprints? And so you're either offsetting it with incorporating an air source heat pump in your house. So maybe you can use less natural gas or fuel oil. And so all of this is part of something that they're incorporating. And so basically, before I go into that, energy efficiency, heat pumps, electrification, all of these terms, everything is moving towards, an end goal. And all of these things tend to work better when they're done holistically. So if you want to put in a solar system, you want to look at some efficiency first. If you want to look at a heat pump, you want to look at efficiency first. You want to pair some solar with that. So all of these things play off each other. And so it's a good thing to just recommend, looking into all of these different options. So with that, I will stop talking and see if we have any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Connor. And I guess since Connor did mention the green addendum, I guess all of these things, if people have been doing them and then are trying to sell the house, the green addendum would be one way of, ensuring that the information gets passed to the potential buyer or to the potential, people who are interested. All right.
Yeah.
So, Meme, do you have any questions? I see you right next to. All right, Michelle.
Yeah, actually, Connor, can you just tell me a little bit about maintenance? I know that you described it as working like, a refrigerator. So how much maintenance do they require? And is there ever a time that you have to put those gases back into the lines?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So ductless mini splits are pretty low maintenance. If you think about heating appliances in general, but even just heat pumps in general, ductless skew towards the low maintenance side. So they have a little filter on them. It's mostly to protect the fan rather than filter the air. So basically, if the homeowner keeps that clean, that's most of their maintenance on the inside. Alternatively, on the outside, maintenance would be making sure snow doesn't pile up around it and rain isn't filling it up. When they defrost in the winter, they might get some icicles, so they might want to go out there and knock them off. We talked a little bit more about those in the builder class a couple of days ago, because we were thinking about, okay, when they're thinking about putting them in. So if somebody puts a heat pump in a bad location where the snow slides off their house, then they might have some maintenance for clearing snow. But those are kind of specific to them. As far as heat pumps in general go, if it's in an ideal location, the only maintenance the homeowner is doing is cleaning that filter. And then the only reason that somebody's going to remove the refrigerant from the system, which I should mention, you have to have an EPA certification to deal with refrigerants. So it's not normally a kind of homeowner DIY approach. But basically, that would be if the system's not working correctly and they got to look for like a leak or something in there, you take all the refrigerant out and then you perform some diagnostics or whatever you're doing, and then you put it back in if you're fixing a leak. But that's not on the homeowner maintenance side. And I would say that's pretty rare. because the way ductless heat pumps work is they're relatively close together. So there's not that many tubing connections to be made. So the more connections you make, the more leak points there are. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, some of the some manufacturers have videos online, and ultimately it seems like most of them have a removable filter that you would just brush off every 4 months. I think they recommended, or every 4 times a year, so every 3 months. So just a removable filter that you would brush off or clean and put back in. Just like a fridge, I guess we are supposed to clean the coils of the fridge, which I have to admit I never do. I better go get on it, but it's just like a fridge, so very low maintenance.
One thing I've noticed with one of our heat pumps, it's in our basement, and a lot of woodworking gets done down there, and so that one, the filters need to get cleaned if there's been a lot of dust in the air. So it just depends on what your air is like, and how that affects how often you have to clean them.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mim. I've seen people come up with kind of custom filter rigs for their own ductless mini splits for people who have woodworking shops. But the main thing is we got to provide adequate airflow, whether that's on the indoor side or the outdoor side. So a lot of people who think that ductless mini splits are ugly in general, they're like, oh, I'm going to put something over this. You got to steer people away from that, because we need that airflow to come out, because it's got to suck in air from the top and distribute it from the bottom. So we got to keep some clearances, which the manufacturer has spelled out in the user guides and manuals. And then likewise on the outside, a lot of people don't want to look at those either. And so they want to cover those up. And it's very important to make sure that there's enough airflow around these systems so we can get adequate air exchange, because people come up with some nice architectural screens, they put them over them, it looks great, but it'll kill the unit.
Could I just add one more thing? A friend of mine was having problems with her heat pump, and she had a repair guy come and look at it. He said, it looks like you've never cleaned these filters. And well, nobody told me that I needed to. So when it was installed, even, she had not been instructed to clean them. And so just as for realtors, whenever I'm dealing with someone that has a heat pump, or they're looking at buying a house with a heat pump, I make sure to educate them about that very point, because it really does affect the efficiency of the heat pump if it's all blocked. You're just not going to get as much heat out of it.
Definitely. Yeah, active homeowners are the best defense against expensive maintenance, but also it's really hard. Not everybody has the time or the interest to really focus on the space heating appliances in their house, but the best thing you can do is inform them about it. We on a lot of our builds, we've been working on making like small magnets and things like that can go on fridges or go on the side. So for instance, we've been making some for HRVs, the heat recovery ventilators. And so you can slap a magnet on the side of that, and they can Sharpie, every 4 months I've replaced the filter, those kind of things. But yeah, active homeowners are the best, and all you can do is show them how it can be done, and it's kind of on them after that.
So I saw that someone posted in the chat, being in tourism at Denali, heat pump air source is a perfect fit for all the summer tourism housing, coupled with grid tie solar.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it gets hot in the interior, so not so bad for residential folks, but when you start putting a lot of people together, either in housing or in a commercial setting, I know if you come up here and you see all the little coffee huts, you'll see some ductless mini splits, because they're really hot in the summer, so they're trying to provide that cooling. And then pairing that in with solar is a great idea. And so, as I was mentioning, like the holistic approach of looking into all of these things, so efficiency, heat pumps, solar systems, all of these things work really well together.
That is great to hear. So, we forgot to do the poll. So Laura, if you can pop up the poll, and then also while people are filling out the poll, if you have any other questions, you can ask that. So you should have seen a pop-up showing class feedback poll. And while people are filling that out, if you have any other questions, just unmute yourself and ask. So in Sitka, I mean, you said that you have a air source heat pump in your place. I mean, is it pretty common in Sitka? I mean, we know that in Juno they are, trying to facilitate the.
There are a lot of heat pumps in Sitka. And I think mostly because we have our hydroelectric dam that provides, 98, 99% of our power. So yeah, I have three. I have one in my rental unit on my top floor, and then the main floor, and then in my basement. I think at one point there were at least 100 of them in Sitka, but I think we've far surpassed that at this point.
That is great to hear.
Yeah, and there's two brands that are sold here. I have the Fujitsu or whatever it's called, and the other one is the
Daikin?
It begins with an M.
Mitsubishi.
Mitsubishi, yes, thank you. Yeah.
When
Great.
did you change? Sorry. When did you install yours?
What's that?
How long have you had them?
Oh, I bought this house in 2016, and we right off the bat got rid of one of we had some ancient radiators. The house was built in the 50s, and so the main floor we put in a heat pump, and then later the basement and the apartment were both using oil, and we wanted to get rid of the monitor stoves in those two places, and so we got new heat pumps. Those are about 2 years old, maybe.
Okay.
And the newer ones are definitely better than the one from 2016. There has definitely been an improvement over time.
Yeah, year over year, they're making a lot of improvements, which can be great.
We've had problems with the 2016 one with icing up. The unit in there failing and just getting not defrosting, not going through the defrosting process in cold weather, and that's happened to us twice. And our installer finally ended up replacing our unit with one that he had in a shop, and we've never heard anything more, and it's not been a problem. So I think it was just that particular unit kept failing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And most of these manufacturers usually give like a 10-year parts warranty. So
Yeah,
if,
we never had
homeowners
to
are
pay
concerned.
anything
Awesome.
for the problem. Yeah, I love them. They're great to have.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we like to hear.
Yeah, and I'm really happy to have the fuel tank gone from our yard forever.
Yeah, so for the people who don't see the polls, apparently if you have an old version of Zoom, you won't see them. So let's see, I think we might not have put, you can see the chat. So I will put my email address into the chat, the easier one. So the easier one is dana@cchrc.org. The questions, and you can just email me those answers if you feel comfortable. The questions were, my overall experience was good and I would recommend similar class to others. So this is class feedback poll. So that's question number one. My overall experience was good and I would recommend a similar class to others. Question number two is, the instructors were knowledgeable about the subject matter. And question number three is, the content of the class fulfilled my expectations. Question number four, would you like to see a more detailed class on any one of the topics presented? And I guess we forgot to switch that from tonight to today. and that was ductless heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, ducted air source heat pumps, attic retrofits, air sealing, ventilation options, crawl space retrofits, energy audits, or other. So just if you have any feedback, if you send me an email, I will be sending the CEU certificates out from my main NREL address. So that will be from dana.truframodra@nrel.gov. So keep an eye out for it. If you don't see it within the next 2 weeks, please absolutely email me and I will get that out. We are just comparing the attendance that we get from Zoom, with the registration. And so I'll be using the registration email that was provided. And if you want it sent to a different address, just email me at that dana@cchrc.org address. And if you have any questions, please email me. I can send those questions on to Connor. And thank you very much for attending.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Take care. Hi. Nice job. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.